Hey, what's up guys? What's up YouTube? I'm going to talk about this Ford F-150 1992 5.0 that I picked up. I did some work for it, so say I did about $1,000 worth of work depending on how you value your time. But what I wanted to do, since I had such a long process trying to fix this truck, it took me about 6 weeks because I was very dedicated to get it to pass smog. I'm down here in San Diego, and as you guys know, the California smog regulations are pretty strict. I picked up this truck from Oregon, and my goal was to basically make sure that it could run properly. When it first started running, I didn't even know that I could get it to pass smog. So I have a bucket full of parts here, and I'm going to bring you through the process of elimination that I had in order to try to fix this truck. I dealt with a ton of very, very common and hair-pulling problems that a lot of you on YouTube and the forums deal with. So I wanted to review how I approach that. So, it all started with the battery cables. Let's talk about the symptoms. First, it was, running very rich. I could smell the gas. Had a huge idle surge. It was going from like sometimes 400 RPMs all the way up to 1200 RPMs. And that fluctuation sometimes would go from 600 to 900 when it was cold. And sometimes it would only happen when I was pressing on the brake. And it was just all over the place. And I know, a lot of people want to jump to conclusions. It's this, it's that, it's this. Well, it's most likely a combination of multiple issues. The first thing that jumps into my mind is vacuum leak. If it's running rich, is it getting enough air? Is it getting enough spark? Tune-up. The list goes on. So first, I noticed it didn't have the proper battery in it. So I replaced the battery terminals. And, I didn't have, a ton of money just to start throwing at it. So the battery that was in there was like 500, 600 cold cranking amps, when spec for this truck is a lot higher than just 600 cold cranking amps. So let's go ahead, and my first problem that I ran into was basically a no start, and it turned into this head scratching issue where I checked the battery. Obviously, I would just turn on the key, I would see the dash lights, and just nothing would happen. I wouldn't hear a click, I wouldn't hear anything. And so I took out my my tester light, verified that there wasn't corrosion from the battery terminals. Then again, the lights were really bright. I checked the starter solenoid, and the starter solenoid was good. So this was my first mistake. I decided to just throw a part on there, just part slap it. And it didn't end up solving the problem. But here was the terminals. They were completely tight, and you could still wiggle the cable on the battery, and so there wasn't a good connection. So I replaced these. That still didn't take care of the problem. This solenoid, which is on the driver's front right side panel, I replaced this, and that didn't seem to do anything. Do keep in mind, you can run a screwdriver and tap these two, and you can actually start the engine underneath the hood. So if you're trying to find TOD or TD, top dead center, TDC, when you're like messing around with the distributor, you can use a screwdriver to help turn the key over slightly. So that's just a little trick. So what I ended up doing with the no start is I started making sure that there was power going from the key to this portion right here. So when the key was on, I did verify that there was power getting to this top solenoid just with my test light, and basically that's just with an alligator clamp. You attach that to basically ground, and you turn on the key and you see if the light comes on, but you put it not on here, you put it into that small wire that goes from the tumbler to the engine compartment and attaches there. And so that was working, and so then I decided to figure out what else could be the problem. So I decided, I heard something about a clutch safety switch, and a clutch safety switch is basically that thing right there. And I noticed that there was a ton of fluid leaking out all over the place and got this whole thing wet, and you could see that there was some corrosion. And so what I ended up doing was taking out the clutch master cylinder, and I ended up replacing the clutch master cylinder. Okay guys, slight problem. This was the stock piston rod. As you can see, this end is shaped funny, and this component right here did not want to fit in there. As you see, it's circle, and it didn't want to fit on there. So this came off the stock one. I don't know how it got bent, but anyways, I had to cut the tip off. I verified that this fit pretty snugly down there. As you can see, I tapped a little hole so that this nub goes right over that, and I can screw it down. It's going to be secure. It's not going to slip off, and then my clutch goes bad. So yeah, just a little bit of extra work. I'm going to get this piston rod out of the old master cylinder. Look at this thing. I destroyed it. I literally had to cut the front of it off to get the piston rod out. But I did it, and it fit the aftermarket one, so I'm happy. I don't think that was the source of the problem, because if you look down, there was a lot of play in the pedal assembly. Whenever I hit this, there was a ton of play right back there in the pedal assembly. Maybe some of you guys are familiar with that. And so whenever I would step on here, there would be a ton of movement. I would have to there would be literally 3 inches of movement in the clutch pedal before it started engaging the rod that went into the clutch master cylinder. So I realized I had to take out the whole pedal assembly as well. So I took out the pedal assembly, and the pivot point where the clutch piston rod connects into the lever that basically pivots inside the pedal assembly. And I'll show you the video, maybe just link it in right here. And that plate had to get rid of. So I ended up replacing that plastic bushing with a metal, basically pipe fitting, and around the clutch rod that goes across the pedal assembly into the lever that controls the clutch rod that goes in and out. So I replaced the clutch master cylinder. I took out the play of the pedal assembly, and I put it back into the its correct position. So then the clutch safety switch was that thing that I showed you, which was this thing right here. If that isn't engaged, if the two metal connectors aren't touching, and a lot of times, ow, that hurt. A lot of the times it'll start with either a clutch master cylinder leaking or play in your pedal, or both. And if the two metal pieces inside that, because what it does is when you push in the rod, it slides a piece of metal and makes a connection and sends a signal to your engine that your clutch is engaged. And so what ended up happening, and I can insert the photo of the old one, the spring ended up getting worn out, and the metal connectors ended up getting corroded because brake fluid ended up leaking out of the back of the clutch master cylinder into the clutch safety switch, not allowing me to not allowing the computer to recognize that the clutch was engaged. So I bypassed it, ordered another one. It started right up. So then obviously I had to get it running and have it start consistently before I can move on to the next step. So I ended up fixing that, and then I realized I tried to get it smogged and it failed miserably, and I sort of knew it was, but I wanted them to do some of the things for 40 bucks, check timing, check how bad it was and all this thing, and it failed horribly. CO2 emissions was like 12 times the recommended amount. Found out that the timing was within spec. It was at 12 degrees, even though perfect is about 10 degrees, but I guess people have said that it runs better off of 12 degrees. So next, it was an automatic fail, he said, honestly, because the check engine light, he said, was disengaged. And I was like, disengaged? I mean, I didn't even know that. I never saw the check engine light. I thought that was a bonus. So he told me it wasn't even working. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up taking apart the dash, as you can see, and it looked like someone had been in here before and broke off a whole bunch of different little pieces because some idiot didn't know what they were doing, taking it off. And basically you take off this panel and then access the bolts through this here, and so it was broken. I'm going to get another one from a junkyard, but that's neither here or there. So what I ended up doing was taking this component out here by getting those little star screws out, and as you can see, it's the little 194 license plate bulb lights that light up the dash. And I noticed that the lights that were behind the oil pressure, voltage regulator, you know, and everything, those weren't working. So I figured, hey, it's probably the bulb. So I took it out, and sure enough, it was the light bulbs. So that was my first step in diagnosing. I needed the check engine light because I wanted to try to diagnose using the codes. Pretty obvious, right? So I replaced all those lights behind the dash, and now I verified when turning the key on that the check engine light would come on, and then, you know, obviously reset the codes and then took it for a drive. And I ended up getting like 6 codes. I ended up getting like a you know, those of you who don't know how to check the codes, it's really simple. You just bypass using a paper clip in the front left-hand corner, and underneath the engine compartment. This video isn't about teaching you how to test it. It's about just telling you the codes and talking about those fixes. But I ended up getting like codes 21, which was a engine coolant temp sensor ECT failure. I forget what code it was, but a map failure. 42 running rich, 41 running lean, and I believe other issues. So I decided to just work on maybe running rich. Oh yeah, when I first got it, the engine coolant temperature gauge wasn't working, and I realized after reading on a forum that the temp gauge isn't connected to the what the computer reads as the engine temperature. So what I ended up doing was first replacing the engine coolant temp sensor, and I also replaced the gauge temperature sensor. Let's go ahead and take a look here. So the engine coolant temp sensor is right there. So I ended up replacing that, and then the engine temp gauge sensor that's for the gauge is right there. And let's see if you can see that. Let it focus in. Anyways, it's right there. As you can see, it's that shiny brass thing. And so I ended up replacing the engine coolant temp sensor and that gauge, and the gauge still didn't work, but the engine coolant temp sensor code went away, which was great news, and I was happy with that. But the engine coolant temp gauge wasn't working. So what I ended up doing was ended up draining out all the coolant and there's a little knob right down there. I don't know if you can see it, but right there. And I just hooked a hose up to that, and I actually drained it into a 5-gallon bucket, and that seemed to be pretty efficient. And then I filled it up with water, ran it for a couple minutes, did it again. There was a lot of crap that came out. And so then when I filled it back up to spec, code 21 ended up coming up again. And so at this point I was a little bit frustrated, and so I was like, okay, what's going on? So I decided to take out the thermostat. When I took out the thermostat, I realized that the thermostat was broken into 3 pieces. You can take a look. I'll insert the picture here. And so after I ended up replacing the thermostat, the engine code went away. Once I flushed out the engine radiator, the gauge ended up working, and so that was it with the heating and cooling issues. But the idle surge, and then code 41 and 42, and then also what popped up was the ERG code, and then there was also still that map code. I'm going to change the battery, 1 second. After verifying that I couldn't see any obvious vacuum leaks, I ended up just sucking it up and going to buy a map sensor. And that map sensor is this. And when I took the old one out, there was actually a little bit of water in there. I replaced that map code, or that map sensor. The idle surge became less crazy. So that was nice. So now I was left with the code 41, code 42, and then the ERG codes, which were, ended up being like a spout code 18, that code 32, 33, 34. That's, 32 is the EVP sensor, which is this little pin that goes right here. There's a pin in there that detects when the diaphragm opens up, is below its threshold during idle, because the EGR isn't supposed to be open when it's running, was coming on intermittently. And then also it was the code 34, which was coming on intermittently, and then also the code 33, which was the EGR not detect. And actually it was code 33 that ended up coming on the most at first, so EGR wasn't opening up. So I opened up the EGR, I took this off. First, what I did is I took off the manifold, and I verified that this pipe right here wasn't clogged or broken at some point in there. So once I verified that it wasn't broken, I ended up taking off the EGR, verified that the piston inside the EGR was working okay, and so I realized it's probably a vacuum leak of some sort in there. And I ended up finding a vacuum leak in the broken right there, and that one took a while, and I ended up having to use a vacuum pump, and I ended up disconnecting this and plugging the other side of where this green one ends, and verified that it wasn't holding a vacuum. So I ended up taking off all this plastic covering and ended up finding a vacuum leak, a cracked hose right in there. You should definitely check all your vacuum lines first with any EGR codes. It's very common for those lines to get old, and they will crack either behind the engine or inside that conduit, so I would definitely make sure that you do that. Once I fixed that vacuum, and I just basically bought an aftermarket double-sided female portion and super glued the 2 ends to the vacuum hoses, the split, and making that connection, verifying that the super glue didn't block anything. And so now the EGR was opening up, but I was still getting code 32 and 34. I was actually getting code 34 the most, meaning that when it was opening up, it would be above the range. So I ended up getting my multimeter and testing the brown green wire right here, and with the black portion of my multimeter ended up connecting it to the negative portion. And I ended up realizing that when the EVP pin was in the down position, it was like 42 or whatever, meaning that the EVP pin ended up being engaged up too much. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up taking off the EVP and then filing off a little bit, because in the closed position you want that as close to 0.24 volts as possible. And sometimes even replacing it with a new EVP, you're going to run into that same issue. So you have to get a multimeter, and you have to check the voltage from the green-brown line, and that's where you're going to put your hot with the key on position and the other one here, and you're basically checking the EGR closed position, because you can't check it while the EGR is engaged. So you want to try to get it as close to 0.24 volts as possible. When I did that, then all of a sudden I kept getting the same code, and I'm scratching my head, and I knew that the EVP was testing out okay, the closed EVP pintle position, and that was okay. But for whatever reason, it wasn't working. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up checking the vacuum lines again, and realized that there's a connector right there where these lines go back here, the vacuum lines, they actually connect to a double male portion where a whole bunch of vacuum lines connect, and there's these plastic pieces. And honestly, nothing was broken, but the vacuum lines weren't holding a vacuum because there wasn't just a good seal. I guess the rubber was old, and a vacuum leak developed in the very small lines where it connects to the plastic pieces. So I basically just cleaned them out, put a little bit of lubricant oil on them that's not a solvent, and then ended up putting back on, checking the vacuums again with my hand vacuum pump, and ended up solving the problem. So then all my EGR codes went away. TAD and TAB tabs that are located right here on the engine, those things back there, and then also the EVR solenoid. I have not yet read a case where replacing those solved the problem, even after being 30 years old, the vehicle. So I wouldn't automatically order those, especially since they don't even make them anymore. Just if you wanted to take them apart and then clean them up a little bit with some electrical cleaner, that might be okay, but I wouldn't automatically diagnose that. So after replacing the EGR issue and fixing those codes, 32, 33, 34, all those gone, I still had the rich code and I still had the lean code. So what I ended up doing is I ended up buying this straw brush, and I ended up cleaning out the idle air control valve. Didn't solve the problem. I ended up cleaning out the throttle body. Didn't solve the problem, and they were very, very clean. And the brush, and it ended up, the throttle response became a lot better. The truck sounded better. But it was still smelling like gas, throwing the 42, throwing the 41, and I didn't know what was going on with that. Also, another issue that I was having when I would fill it up with gas, the gas handle kept triggering to stop on me, and it ended up being this, because this is the canister purge solenoid, and the canister purge solenoid is right there. And so if that has a major vacuum leak, then that can cause an idle surge, right? Because one thing I ended up doing is that I ended up making my own home smoke tester, basically with some pipes, putting a piece of charcoal in there, a torch, and then using a bicycle pump and pumping it into the brake booster. And I did find a vacuum leak coming from the PVC valve that connects into the top of the valve cover. It was actually from the smoke leak that was just blowing out whenever I would pump. The bike pump was actually coming from where the PVC valve would go into the intake manifold. There's a little 90-degree rubber hose. So I ended up replacing that rubber hose, and that leak went away. But I didn't see any other leaks after I replaced the PVC valve, and the PVC valve was disgusting, and it was probably stuck open, which was probably a contributor to the problem as well. But that didn't end up solving the issue either. So you just have to keep trying new things. I ended up having to replace the throttle body gasket, obviously. I told you about replacing the map sensor, and here's the old map sensor. So the fuel filter, I went underneath the truck and it looked like the fuel filter was new, so that's the new one. I didn't replace that. The O2 sensor was totally caked with a ton of soot, and was really stuck in there, so I put some penetrating oil on there, let it sit. It came out like butter, but the penetrating oil was just, you know, covered in soot. I made sure my distributor was on right. I checked the firing order, and I was really scratching my head. So one of the last things that I did was, I should have done this first, and maybe you guys should check this. Check the fuel pressure. I ended up checking the fuel pressure, and you check the fuel pressure by connecting your fuel pressure gauge to that little Schrader valve right there. So I checked the fuel pressure, and the fuel pressure was 70 psi when specification is 35 psi. So that was obvious for me. I decided to replace the fuel pressure regulator, and they say that the fuel pressure regulator will be, it's that little shiny thing with that red hose, that right there, and they say that that if it's bad, you take off that red hose and it smells like gas. But I didn't smell any gas, but that's because it was stuck open. The diaphragm wasn't leaking, it was just stuck open. So this was the biggest contributor to the way it was running. And what caused the O2 sensor to go bad, what was causing the idle surge. I replaced the fuel pressure regulator, we call that the FPR, and the idle surge went away, and it was running amazing. It ended up going from like 8 miles per gallon to like 18 miles per gallon. So I was pumped on that. And so then I reset the codes again, disconnecting the batteries for about 10 minutes and tapping them together. Make sure you don't fry your computer. Is I ended up resetting the codes. I ended up driving it yet again. What code did I have left? I took care of the ECT, map sensor, all the EGR codes. I took care of the rich code because it was dumping extra fuel and there was a ton of non-spent gas that was going into the exhaust. I ended up still being left with a code 41. So the way that I figured it out, I was here one time, it was running great, and then all of a sudden I'd hit the brake just like that, and the idle would start to surge, and it would bog down and it would come up, bog down and come up. And it was weird because it would run great during idle when I'd set the idle, and I could let it run for 10 minutes and nothing would happen. It would run great. But then as soon as I'd start driving it, I'd come up to a stop sign, and then yet again that dreaded idle surge would come up. And then it dawned on me, oh, it only happens when I press the brake pedal. So all of a sudden, I started to realize, oh, I'm hearing a slight hiss after I turn off the truck. So what I decided to do was turn on the truck, put my head right next to the pedal where the brake pedal rod goes into the brake booster, and just to listen. And sure enough, when the engine was warm, I'd let it run for about 10 minutes. It's creating a vacuum, the engine, it was at running temperature. I would press on the pedal, and hallelujah, I heard a hissing sound. So that was my code 41. That's where the air was leaking in. That's why it would run like shit when my foot was depressing on the brake. And that was the last issue. So I replaced the brake booster and solved the problem. Now make sure when you install the brake booster, you adjust the piston rod that goes into the master correct so that your pedal is where you want it to be. Now it runs like a frickin' 5.0 Mustang. You guys gotta listen to this. Yeah. So I am pumped now. After I got all this done, I ended up passing Smog. And here's my result. At 25 miles per hour, the hydrocarbons measured now after it's 66. but before it was like 1,200, like literally like 12 to 20 times the recommended specs. I did set the timing to 10 degrees, so now it has perfect timing. I just wanted this truck to run stock. Some people like 12 degrees better, but you know, I didn't. And I ended up replacing that battery